Today we're going to begin filling in a gap that most Christians at least have no idea about. And that is what happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. How many of you have ever heard about anything that happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament? Okay, like what?
Remember I got told that. I can't think of it on the top of my head.
Right?
I don't remember the name, but there were some wars or something that, like, there was a book. Like Mr. Lambert.
Okay, now, I don't mean to denigrate what you said, but if you picked any time in history, could you say that there are probably wars and
Yeah.
what?
I mean, like, there was, like, some
Can you-
bigger war that...
Yeah, there was an important war, that's
Yeah.
true. And there were some books written about that time, yeah.
The Maccabees.
Yeah.
Time of the Maccabees, okay,
Uh-huh.
good. How do you know about the Maccabees? Have you read the book of the Maccabees?
No, but I know about it.
All right. So you can say that even those of you that know a little bit don't know a lot about that time period, and as I said, most Christian people don't know anything at all. But there are some important things that happened during that time period that affect our understanding of things that happen in the Gospels, especially, and in the New Testament in general. So it's an important thing for us to know. Plus, it's pretty interesting, although it does get a bit complicated. I've done something and I should say this, that many things that happened during that time period were predicted by God through Daniel in Daniel chapter 11. So the way we're going to approach this is to read verses in Daniel 11. You've already read Daniel 11. How many of you are a little bit confused about everything that's going on in Daniel 11? Okay, if you're honest, yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you what everything there means and what actually happened to fulfill the prophecy that Daniel made. Does that sound interesting? All right. Now, you're going to be responsible for knowing, in general, things that happen to a few specific people, but other than that, there'll be a lot of names coming and going, and you won't have to know all of those. But I would suggest that I have not left blanks for you to fill because this is difficult enough. So I would suggest, and it looks like I already did the highlighting for you, so that doesn't help either. But maybe pay close attention to the highlighting. Maybe write little notes or arrows for things that are important. Approach it that way. Now, the other thing I'll tell you is that I compiled this myself, and I don't know of any other place where you can find this, where you had Daniel 11 side by side with what happened. So, yeah, you could, if you want to give me extra money at Christmas for that, then that would be fine. So this is a gem. Took a lot of hard work, and it is something that I think you'll find interesting and maybe useful even in years to come, as you may have opportunity to think about this time period again. All right, so let's look at the intertestamental period. Give us a little background. We have the Old Testament era, which ends with the book of Malachi, the prophet Malachi. And he was there for around 3 years that he was prophesying. And then we have what are called the silent years. Anybody know how many years it was that God was silent? 400 years. Now, think about that. Israel was used to, every once in a while, a prophet comes along and speaks for God. So every once in a while, they would hear from God. And then they go 400 years and never hear a word. 400 years. How long is that? Well, what was happening in our world 400 years ago? What date would that be?
Like 1619-ish.
Yeah, 1619. What was going on in the world then? 1619.
Pilgrims and people were coming to America.
Not even yet. 1620 is when the Pilgrims first came. There was a settlement in Jamestown, and in 1619, they had been there for a few years. In 1619, the English king decided that Jamestown could now function with a government of their own without being ruled by soldiers. and by the king himself, and so they established the first legislative body in the United States called the House of Burgesses. And in 1619, they got their first boatload of women. That was important for the colony to survive. They helped shape up the men a little bit. And we also had the first boatload of slaves. So 1619 was a very important year in the United States, but how long ago does that seem to you? Does that seem like a different world? Yeah. Because most of even the East Coast of the United States hadn't been settled. We had one colony, one settlement in Jamestown, and now in the following year we'll get one up in Plymouth. Other than that, this is just all wild country with Native Americans living here and there. So can you imagine going from that time till now, and you're used to hearing from God periodically, but now there's nothing. God is silent. What would you think?
Is he gone?
Is he gone? Does he not love us anymore? Do we not belong to him anymore? So it was a very trying time. And there's some things that happen here that are going to be trying as well. And then, of course, we come to the New Testament era. So we're looking at this silent period, which is called the Intertestamental, because it's in between. Inter means in between the testaments. Now, to give a brief overview of this time period, at the beginning, Israelites, or the Jews that are left from the tribe of Judah, are ruled by the Persians. Well, and we know about that. We know that under the Persians that they started working on rebuilding the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. Remember all that? But then we know that Alexander the Great came in and conquered the Persians. And so there's dominion by the Greeks. And particularly when Alexander the Great dies, there's going to be a division of his empire between how many generals? 4. 4 generals. Remember the 4-headed leopard? It was in Daniel's prophecy. And so there's going to be one of those generals we'll look at, his descendants that are going to dominate. Then there's going to be a revolt against that Greek ruler called the Maccabean Revolt. And there's going to be an independent Jewish state. We'll see what happens there. And then Rome's going to come in. And so by the time we get to the New Testament, 37 BC on down, Rome has been in charge. So when we arrive at the beginning of the New Testament, Rome is thoroughly in control, which you can tell by reading the Gospels, right? So we're going to see, how did it happen? How did they come into being in control? How do we move from here down to here? All right, so look on your page there, and you can see an introduction that in verse 1 of chapter 11, we see in the first year of Darius the Mede, talking about Daniel, arose to be an encouragement and protection for him. And he says, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. Remember, that was talking about Xerxes. As soon as he becomes strong enough for his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the Roman Greeks. And we know that. Xerxes went against Greece. Remember that, right? Verse 3, and a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Okay, who do you think that mighty king is? Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is that mighty king. Now, and if I've got side by side there, but if you need to make an arrow to show that or whatever, I'll make sure that you get that now. So we see that Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the area between Asia and Europe, and brought about an end of the Persian Empire. And he further brought further expansion to the Greek Empire through the destruction of Tyre. Remember that? The interesting thing there. The sparing of Jerusalem, the capture of Egypt, and invasion of India. All right, now look at verse 4 in Daniel 11. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass. All right, so what's that talking about?
Is that when he died and then all of his people took over parts of what he had?
Yeah. So as soon as he has arisen. In other words, as soon as he gained control of the world, and what was it? Right after he gained control of all that, he died, right? Unexpectedly. And it was broken up and parceled out between 4 points of the compass. Well, 4 generals took different directions. So one took east, one took south, and one took north, and one took west. All right, generally speaking. And it says, though not to his own descendants. The prophecy was even so specific to say that none of the people that inherited his kingdom were his own descendants. And we know that's true, right? We know that his son was kept under the custody of one of the generals, Cassander, but he was murdered. His uncle had also been assassinated, and so he had no direct relatives to take over. All right, then we go back over to Daniel. Nor according to his authority which he wielded. In other words, he didn't decide how the empire was to be divided up. The generals did among themselves later. For his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. All right, so now we look at the 4 generals. If you look in your notes there on the right, you can see that first we have Ptolemy Soter. This gives a little clearer, although it's not as accurate, but it's a little clearer picture. Here's Ptolemy, who is ruling over Egypt and Palestine. All right, see the area there. Now, under the Ptolemies, the Jews that lived here in the area of Palestine, those that had come back from Babylon, were treated with consideration. The Ptolemies allowed them to control their own internal affairs. So that was good. All right, then you have Seleucus the first Nicator, who took Syria and Mesopotamia. So that's the Seleucid Empire, Seleucid. So here's Syria, this area is called Syria, and then over here in Mesopotamia, which is the old Persian and Babylonian area. All right, everybody following? Make sure you raise your hand if you're not getting something, because it will get complicated at some point here. All right, Antipater and his son Cassander took Greece and Macedonia. So that's over here, Greece and Macedonia. And then Lysimachus ruled Asia Minor. Okay, we got that so far? All right, next page. Verse 5. Then the king of the south. Now, if you're looking at this, who's the king of the south? Ptolemy, right. The king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed. All right, look on the right, we see the explanation. Ptolemy, his ambitions extended far beyond the borders of Egypt to Palestine and the rest of Asia. So he's attempting to take over a wider area than what he had been given. Temporarily, his naval forces captured Cyprus, here, and important bases in Asia Minor. So some places along here, along the coast. And there were even times when he wielded considerable influence over some of the city-states of the Greek mainland. All right, the prince who gained ascendancy was Seleucus Nicator of the Seleucid Empire. He was given authority to rule over Babylon. But in 316, when Babylon came under attack by another general, whose name was Antigonus, Seleucus sought help from Ptolemy Soter in Egypt. So Seleucus is under attack and from a Greek general, and he asks Ptolemy to help him. Why? Because Ptolemy had gotten really strong and had taken over some other areas. Follow? So he's asking him for help. After Antigonus' defeat in 312, Seleucus returned to Babylon, and he became strong with Ptolemy's help. 2 years after that, he assumed the title of king in Babylon. So in 310, he became the official starting date for the Seleucid era. So the Seleucids really gained power and control, started really ruling in 310 BC. He ruled over Babylon, Media, and Syria. I guess we'll go back to this map more clear. So Babylon, Media, and Syria. Those are the three big areas there. And he assumed the title of king. Since Seleucus secured control of Alexander's old domains all the way to the Indus on the east, so all the way over here, and to Syria and Phoenicia on the west, his authority far surpassed that of his sponsor, Ptolemy of Egypt. So what it's saying is that he got more powerful than the guy who had been helping him. Ptolemy had expanded his territories to Palestine and into Asia. So, you've got these two powerful people now. What do you suppose is going to happen next?
They're going to fight.
They're going to end up fighting. All right, well, let's see what happens here. Follow on down. The families of Ptolemy and Seleucus fought. Later, they would enter into an alliance. Ptolemy Soter died in 285 BC, and Ptolemy II Philadelphus, his son, ruled in Egypt. Meanwhile, Seleucus was murdered in 281, and his son, Antiochus Soter, ruled after him. Then Seleucus' grandson, Antiochus II Theos, ruled in Syria. All right, but before we... so it's under Ptolemy II Philadelphus that we have some interesting things developing. And that is, the major city in Greece by this time now had become Alexandria, started by Alexander the Great. And there were a lot of Jewish people living there in Alexandria. You remember later, about 400 years later, when Joseph is escaping from Herod the Great with Jesus and Mary, where do they go? They go to Egypt. Why? Because there's a lot of Jewish people living there, and especially in Alexandria, because that was a major city. Well, the Jewish people that were living in Egypt no longer spoke Hebrew. So what can't they do? If they no longer speak Hebrew, what can't they do?
Compete with them.
With who? All right. If they ever travel up there, they might not be able to communicate with them, but what can't they do where they are? They can't read the scriptures. Is that important to Jewish people? Yeah, remember when they were in Babylon? They had no temple anymore? What became the primary focus? Reading the law of God, teaching the law of God. All right, now, some of these have lived in Egypt for several generations, and they've forgotten their Hebrew. They haven't used it, so they've forgotten it. They no longer can read the scriptures. So what's their solution? Have a Hebrew class that they all take? No, they don't do that. What's their solution?
Change it to the Greek.
That's right. They translate the Hebrew what we call the Old Testament, the Hebrew books of the law and prophets, into Greek, because they all speak Greek. Everybody speaks Greek, and so they do that. Here is a picture of the Alexandrian library, and part of it was the library wanted to have a copy of the Old Testament scriptures too. But see all these scrolls. I mean, this is they don't have shelves and books. Everything's in scrolls, and so you see all these scrolls that are here, and then consider that whole room. And I'm not sure how many rooms there were, but there were thousands of scrolls in that library. Another thing that was built at this time that you've heard of is this is when the Pharos Lighthouse of Alexandria. Remember when we looked up the 7 wonders of the ancient world? This was one of them. It was built during this time when the Ptolemies are in control of Egypt. All right, here is the family, the genealogy of the Ptolemies, beginning with Ptolemy the First, and we'll be referring to some of these people as we go along. It looks overwhelming right now, but one thing that you can maybe take comfort in is if you are asked anything about someone in the Ptolemy family, if it's a male, you can pretty much figure it's going to be named Ptolemy, and if it's a female, probably going to be named Cleopatra. It just depends on what number goes after it, right? And we're not very creative in their naming. All right? So let's look back at your paper here. And let's go back to the idea of the Septuagint. Let's see. Oh, before we do that, here's kind of an overview of the two dynasties. The first of all, Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. Here's where it begins. They are going to fight over the area of Israel-Palestine, back and forth. Here's some of the important people along the way. Ending with Cleopatra, that you've heard of. She's actually Cleopatra the Seventh, the one that you've heard of, that had a couple of children by Julius Caesar that we looked at before. Married Mark Antony, committed suicide. She was actually the seventh. Then the Seleucids took Persia, parts of Asia Minor, founded the Seleucid dynasty with Antioch as the capital city, the same Antioch where the Apostle Paul spent his early years as a Christian. The Seleucid dynasty had a lot of internal strife, weakening of the kingdom until it was finally taken by this guy in 83 BC, and it became part of the Roman Empire in 64 BC. All right, so that's kind of an overview of the whole history of the two dynasties, and some of what's happening other places as well. All right, so we're in verse 5 now, where the king of the south has grown strong. The prince, who is Seleucid, has asked for his help, and after getting help, then Seleucid becomes strong himself, and well, this just shows him coming back to Babylon and becoming king. All right, so Ptolemy the First is the founder of the Library of Alexandria, and at the same time we have Seleucus Nicator, founder of Antioch, which we've already talked about. All right, next, after Ptolemy the First comes his son, Ptolemy the Second. At least he gives him an additional name to keep them separate, Philadelphus. You see Ptolemy the Second Philadelphus murdered his brother and then married his sister. That's the kind of stuff that's going to be going on here. He enlarged the Library of Alexandria, and it was under his direction that the Hebrew Scriptures were translated into Greek, which is called the Septuagint, which means 70. That's a Roman numeral for 70, because supposedly 70 or 72 scholars worked on the translation. Now, one of the reasons was for the translation was what I said, and that is the Jewish people forgot how to speak Hebrew, and they needed something in a language they understood. Secondly, and this was probably a more immediate reason, is that there was an Egyptian historian named Manetho, pictured here, who wrote a history of Egypt. And when he covered the time period when the Hebrews were in Egypt and left in the Exodus, we know what happened there from what it says in the book of Exodus, right? But Egyptians didn't like what happened there, and they tried to make up some other story, and he actually said that they had kicked out the Israelites from Egypt because they had leprosy. So that explains why the Hebrews left. Well, how does that affect the Jewish people that are living there in Egypt, especially Alexandria? They think, well, wait a minute, that's not right. That's not what happened. And so one of the reasons for having the Greek translation was to correct this misinformation and to distinguish themselves from the Palestinian Jews as well, because there was a negative impression of them. So they wanted to impress the Egyptians with the antiquity of their law and of their race, and to show that they weren't kicked out of Egypt. They wanted to leave. And it wasn't because they had leprosy. So they consented to have a Greek translation of the Hebrew text called the Septuagint, symbolized by LXX. Now, This tells us a little bit about the Septuagint. It's a collection of the ancient Jewish scriptures. HB means the Hebrew Bible. It's larger than the Hebrew Bible because it includes some books that aren't in the Hebrew Bible. For example, they include the books Deuterocanonica, or the books are called Deuterocanonical or apocryphal books. I think someplace I have a couple is written down. Let's see if we come to it. And I think that's all we need to do there. It's the first translation of any part of the Bible, translated into Greek. And the reason it's important for our understanding of the New Testament even is that when the Old Testament is quoted in the Gospels, for example, many times it's quoting from the Septuagint because they knew it there in Palestine as well. They knew the Greek translation. It was what was used during the early life of Jesus, and that which the apostles used. All right, so that's the Septuagint. And there's some reasons given to you there in your notes as to why it was not Palestinian Jews that translated. Some have tried to make that case, but it would not have been done by Jews living in Palestine. They never would have consented to do that. So you can read over that, but you don't have to know that. All right. Let's see. Next, verse 6. After some years, they will form an alliance. All right. Who's the they? The they is Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So what do we find here? Ptolemy II forms an alliance with Antiochus II, who is Antiochus Theos. Theos, you remember, is the Greek word for what? You don't know the word Theos? Theology? God. So his name was Antiochus God. And we see that they were bitter enemies, but they entered into an alliance. And to seal the alliance, Ptolemy II, or Ptolemy Philadelphus, gave his daughter Bernice to Antiochus Theos. That's, in the ancient world, that's how you solidify a treaty, right? You send your daughter or someone of value to marry the other person. Now, there's a problem with this arrangement, and that is Antiochus already had a wife, whose name was Laodice. And she was very powerful and influential. She was also his half-sister. So she's in the royal family. In order to marry Bernice to bring about this treaty, he divorced Laodice. That did not make her very happy, even though it was politically advantageous to have an agreement with Egypt. So she organized a conspiracy, and operating from her place of banishment, where she had been sent after the divorce, she worked against her former husband. The marriage to Bernice really did not last, because Ptolemy II, her father, died. And when that happened, Antiochus figured this arrangement no longer is of use to me, and so he divorced Bernice and remarried Laodice. Are you following? It's going to get worse, I guarantee you. All right, so Laodice still is bearing a grudge over the fact that her husband divorced her, even though he now remarried her. And so to get revenge, she had Bernice and her infant son murdered. That's in verse 6, where it says, after some years they form an alliance. The daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. That's the marriage of Bernice. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up. That's what given up or handed over means. She will be killed. And not long after that, the king himself was poisoned to death. Now, we don't know for sure who did it, but what would be a good guess? Yeah, I think that that would be consistent with her character, right? So, the pro-Laodice party engineered a coup d'etat to put her in power as queen regent during the time when her son, Seleucus II, was too young to rule. And so, in that way, the prophecy was fulfilled about Bernice being given up or handed over along with the nobles who supported her in Antioch, and the one who sired her. Okay, verse 7 then sets up the subsequent reprisal as we come to after Ptolemy Philadelphus dies, then we come to his son Ptolemy Eugetes, which means benefactor. And he organized a great expeditionary force against Syria in order to avenge his sister's death. So he's marching against Syria because he didn't like the fact they killed his sister. And that war went from 246 to 241. And in the course of that, Ptolemy captured and pillaged the Seleucid capital of Antioch, revenged his sister's death by executing Laodice, and invaded its eastern domains as far as Bactria, which is way over here. Seleucus II, remember he's the son who was to take over, but he was too young at the time. But he hides in Asia Minor while this is all going on. Because the Egyptians are going this way, and then they go this direction, so he goes this direction, hides up in here. Ptolemy III, or Eugetes, shattered the Seleucid navy in the Aegean Sea and remained the foremost naval power in that region for the duration of his reign. He succeeded on other fronts as well. And you look at verse 7. One of the descendants will arise in his place. He will come out against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. And that's what's happening. Ptolemy III is displaying great strength up here. He's defeating them. He reunited Cyrenaica at the western end of Libya with the Ptolemaic domains after it had enjoyed 12 years of independence. He also recovered all of his father's conquests on the coasts of Asia Minor and temporarily gained control of some portions of Thrace, which is up in above Greece. All right, so this is the beginning of the conflict between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. So Ptolemy has moved against the Seleucids, has captured a lot of their territory, has increased his strength throughout all of that. All right, so tomorrow we'll come back to verse 8 and find out what Daniel is talking about there in 11:8, and we'll continue our look at the conflict between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Any questions?